Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of Digital Fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today we have Day 8, the start of Week 2, I guess, if you want to call it that, of spoiler season for Duskmourn. Bunch of cards dropped today, still only a few rares, but I kind of like this strategy coming from Wizards of the Coast. In past sets, we got all the rares really quickly, and then the last couple days of spoiler season, it was just kind of a common dump, and that always gets boring. So I like that they're trickling out these rares in batches at a time, so we still have some to talk about every single day. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the rest of the days, the rest of the set to be spoiled, but today we're here to talk about today's spoilers, Monday's spoilers. This is spoiler season day 8, so let's get to it. First of all, before we do, make sure you like the video if you haven't already. These are a ton of work to create and put up for you guys, so every single like helps me get it out to more people, and I would appreciate that a ton. Also, subscribe here if you're new so you never miss an upload. Tons of crazy content on the way, lots of spoiler stuff still to come, my top 10 favorite cards of the set, my 10 new brews that I'm the most interested in playing during Early Access, and that reminds me, Early Access is happening on September 18th. I'm doing a 24-hour marathon stream. We're going to be trying out all the crazy new standard ideas that are in my brain, and then every single day, starting on that day, we're going to get a new deck tech uploaded on YouTube. Tons of crazy ideas coming, so get ready for that. Now let's dive into these cards. First up, we have Fear of Abduction. This is 2 white and 4 for a 5/5 enchantment creature nightmare, and as an additional cost to cast it, you have to exile a creature you control. It has flying. When it enters, you exile target creature an opponent controls as well, and when Fear of Abduction leaves the battlefield, you put each card exiled with it into its owner's hand. I actually kind of like this. It reminds me a lot of the multicolor legendary creature we got that did something similar back during... what set was that in? Maybe it was in New Capenna? I forget. If you remember the card that I'm talking about, let me know in the comments. But similar to that, but way more expensive. That was a 3-drop. This is a 6-drop. That being said, you have a win condition here. A 5/5 flyer tacked on. And granted, 6 mana is a lot, especially in Limited. Well, 6 mana isn't as much in Limited as it would be Constructed, right? So this is way more reasonable in Limited. In fact, I think this might be a very high pick in Limited specifically, because it is a win condition that just puts your opponent on such a quick clock while also taking out their most problematic threat, right? So, I don't know. I think this card might be a slam dunk in Limited. In Constructed, it might just be too expensive no matter how much value it gets you. That being said, I do like that you could use this as a way to reset one of your creatures or flicker it to get extra value, essentially, while also temporarily taking your opponent's, power off the field. So there's some interesting ways to use it. I like it a lot. I think in Limited it's going to be nuts. Probably too expensive for Constructed, but I could see a world in where there's some kind of weird reanimation deck or a deck that can cheat this out a lot quicker, where it's actually useful. So maybe we'll have to wait and see. But next up, we've got Arabella, Abandoned Doll. This is a 1/3 legendary artifact creature toy for 2 mana in the colors of Boros. And whenever Arabella attacks, it deals X damage to each opponent and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures you control with power 2 or less. So this is just everything Boros Convoke wants, right? That deck goes wide with a ton of small creatures super quick, and this can just swing in and drain for a ton of life. That sounds... oh man, that actually sounds obnoxious. Boros Convoke's not going anywhere, guys. It's only getting upgrades. This might even be useful outside of that deck in other power 2 or less style aggro decks. Draining is insanely good, because not only are you dealing extra damage that, they can't really stop, it's not combat damage, but you're also gaining life, and so you're helping to win that race. So against another aggro deck, this is going to be especially good, because not only are you burning them down quick, but you're able to make it so that them trying to burn you down quick isn't happening nearly as quick. And the more I think about it, the more I start to realize why this is legendary. I think the card is just awesome. Definitely a high pick in limited because it's easy to build around and just make this an absolutely insane win condition. That being said, it can just be blocked and killed, right? But if you're building your deck appropriately, you probably only ever need to swing once with this, and it puts you so far ahead as far as the win clock, as far as winning the race, that even if they do block it, you're probably poised to take that game. But I don't know, we'll have to wait and see. Let's move on. We've got Friendly Ghost, 1 white and 3 for a 2/4 spirit with flying, and when it enters, target creature gets +2/+4 until end of turn. This isn't bad for a common. This is nice filler if you're missing 4-drop slots, if you need a little bit of evasion. It's got a nice little ETB ability that makes one of your creatures a very viable threat that turn. I guess the only thing I really hate about it is you can only use that +2/+4 in an offensive manner, right? You can't really use it to buff your dude on blocks because this doesn't have flash or anything like that. Probably be a little too good at common if it had flash, to be honest. That being said, this is nice filler for limited. Next up, we've got Unable to Scream, 1 blue for an enchantment aura, enchants a creature. As long as enchanted creature is face down, it can't be turned face up, and the creature loses all abilities and is a toy artifact creature with base power and toughness 0/2 in addition to its other types. So this is a nice little bit of removal just in general. Turn their big bomb into a 0/2. Loses all of its abilities, so any kind of relevant triggered abilities, abilities that trigger on attack or whatever, are just gone. It's just straight up removal for 1 mana. Granted, they still have a 0/2. They can block, right? But they're probably just gonna block and die in combat, right? So it's not straight up removal, but it's about as close as I can possibly expect to see straight up removal at common in blue. And then the fact that it has this other kind of mode that interacts with one of the set mechanics where you can't turn face down creatures face up is actually going to be super good silver lining value depending on the decks you're up against, specifically depending on if your opponent's playing Manifest Dread. And I have a feeling that everyone's going to have a little bit of a sprinkle of Manifest Dread in their decks. Maybe not everyone, but I would say more often than not, you're probably going to run into at least a little bit as just a little bit of extra something. Even in the decks that aren't built around it. So this could end up being a lot more useful than it looks, but I love this at common. Easy 1 mana way of dealing with any problematic creature at common is awesome. But next up, we've got Grand Entryway and Elegant Rotunda. This is another enchantment room. Grand Entryway is 1 white and 1. When you unlock this door, create a 1/1 white glimmer enchantment creature token. And then Elegant Rotunda is 1 white and 2. When you unlock this door, you put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. This card is going to be really awesome in Eerie decks because for just 2 mana, you get the room itself as 1 enchantment, and then you get this 1/1 white glimmer enchantment creature token as well. So you get 2 Eerie triggers off just 1 2-mana spell, which is really, really amazing. So the fact that you can get a little bit of extra value later on by paying 3 mana and dishing out a couple +1/+1 counters is honestly gravy, and that's really, really tasty gravy when you consider the fact that this is a common. This is just going to be really good and limited, I think, especially good in Eerie decks for sure. But even outside of Eerie decks, just, you know, getting a creature onto the field that gives you this extra value later on is going to be really nice. So I actually think this card is awesome. It makes me want to experiment so much more with the Eerie decks. Seeing any card at all that's giving you multiple enchantments with just 1 card is really interesting when you take into account the Eerie mechanics. So anyway, next up we've got Hardened Escort. This is a 2/4 human soldier for 1 white and 2. When it attacks, another target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains indestructible until end of turn. This is another filler card. If you're coming up short on 3-drops and you're limited, you pick this up later in the draft, you fill out your curve. It's going to be really interesting with survivor decks because you can make it so that your survivor creature can swing in with that indestructible and not be killed in combat so that it survives and then gets to trigger its survivor ability in the second main phase. So if you're in the survivor deck, this goes up in value. It's still not going to be a super high pick, but you're going to want to consider grabbing this a little bit earlier. Otherwise, it's just, you know, 3 mana filler for your 3-drop curves on curve spot, you know. But we're going to move on to our first rare of the day. This is Enduring Courage. 2 red and 2 for a 3/3 enchantment creature, Dog Glimmer. All of these Enduring creatures count as Glimmer creatures, which is awesome because there is a mechanic within the set that cares about Glimmer creatures, and if you already have a Glimmer creature on the battlefield, sometimes you can get extra value off things. So keep that in mind. That's a little bit of extra value this has. And also, just like all of the Enduring creatures, when Enduring Courage dies, if it was a creature, you return it to the battlefield under its owner's control, except it becomes an enchantment and not a creature anymore. So every single Enduring creature has this like second life, where it's no longer a creature, but it still comes back and its ability is still relevant. With this one, that ability is whenever another creature you control enters, it gets +2/+0 and haste until end of turn. This card's really, really good. One way of looking at it is it's an expensive ability for an aggro deck that by the time you play it, you're probably out of gas, and then you don't really have any creatures to play to get value off of it. But I think if you think of it like that, you're doing the card a bit of a disservice. Even though it gives haste and +2 attack to everything, I don't necessarily think it goes in an aggro deck. What I'm thinking of is maybe use this with something like Beseech the Mirror, where you sacrifice it to fetch a 4-drop, and because it's an Enduring creature, it comes back as the enchantment still with the ability, and then you can fetch any really big threatening 4-drop creature. It's going to come right onto the battlefield immediately, and Enduring Courage is now back on the field, so it's going to give that creature +2/+0 and haste, and you can swing in with it immediately. So thinking of really outside the box ways of utilizing this, I think is where it's really going to shine. The fact that it can be destroyed and still come back. You can flicker it after it comes back to turn it back into the creature version, and then they have to kill it 2 more times. So there's a lot of value to be had in a card like this in a mid-range deck, I think, and I think that's where it will shine. So don't get stuck in the trap of thinking of this as an aggro card just because it buffs power and gives haste. This is definitely meant to be in mid-range, and if it's in a deck that cares about enchantments, all the better. But let's move on. Next up, we've got Vanish from Sight. This is 1 blue and 3 for an instant. Target non-land permanent's owner puts it on top or bottom of their library, and you surveil one. This is a nice little bit of common removal. We're seeing a lot of commons that are either just very basic removal or just very basic creatures. Everything at the common slot is very playable, which kind of tracks with their most recent sets ever since they introduced the play boosters. So that limited is, you know, you don't get stuck in these traps when you're drafting, where if you're not a super experienced player, you have a bunch of unplayable cards, right? It just seems like all the commons are way more playable. This one is fine. It'll fill that curve. If you're low on removal, right, you can jam this, use it as a tempo advantage, get a little extra value by surveilling. That obviously goes up in value if you're in like a self-mill deck or a delirium deck or something like that, so keep that in mind. But yeah, just filler removal here. Next up, we've got Innocuous Rat. Anytime I see a rat, I get excited because Rat Tribal is insane right now. If you saw the Swarm deck, then you know just how insane it can be. I'm surprised more people aren't playing it on the standard ladder, to be completely honest. But this one is a 1/1 rat for 1 black and 1, and when it dies, you get to Manifest Dread. Now, I go back and forth on if this might actually be worth trying in the standard legal rat deck, because if you manage to Manifest Dread and hit one of your big threatening rat cards, you could turn it face up and turn it into that rat card, and that would actually be a ton of value, while still getting, you know, the initial value of this being a rat on the battlefield. At the end of the day, I don't think it quite makes the cut. I think it ends up being a little too slow, but the fact that there's a common that's even considerable is kind of impressive, and I do think in Limited, this is going to be really, really good, especially in the Manifest Dread deck, or in the Delirium deck, where you want to be putting stuff in your graveyard. So I think this is absolutely usable. A 1/1 that turns into a 2/2 with 2 little bits of upside, one being that 2/2 could essentially be a much bigger threat if you happen to hit the right card, the other being you get to put something in your graveyard. All of that is pretty welcome in Limited, so I actually think this will see a fair amount of play, at least as far as the common goes. The commons go. I'm tired, leave me alone. Next up, we've got Murder. Murder is back! An instant for 2 black and 1. and it murders things. I guess Pinhead has only one hobby. Next up, we've got Resurrected Cultist. 1 black and 2 for a 4/1 human cleric with Delirium. For 2 black and 2, you can return Resurrected Cultist from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. Activate only if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, and only as a sorcery. So anytime you've got Delirium turned on, this just comes back from the graveyard for 4 mana, which it is a little bit expensive, right? It's still a really good card though. 4 power for 3 mana. This can trade really well. I think at common, this is actually a relatively high pick, but I think where it gets the most interesting is in self-mill decks where you're trying to turn on Delirium and get value into the graveyard, and then while you're self-milling yourself, this is just free value. Once it's in the yard, it doesn't matter that you never drew it and played it normally, right? You can just play it right from the yard for 4 mana and just get extra value, just free card advantage. So I think it might be really cool in those decks. It might actually end up a high pick if that archetype ends up really taking off in Limited. So really cool card. But next up, we've got Impossible Inferno. 1 red and 4 for an instant. It deals 6 damage to any creature. It also has Delirium. If there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, exile the top card of your library. You may play it until the end of your next turn. Seeing this kind of card advantage on a common is actually kind of nutty. Now, granted, it is expensive, but it's not prohibitively expensive, right? 5 mana is something that you can handle. And the fact that it's instant speed and it's a whopping 6 damage, it can deal with almost any threat, any big bomb that your opponent plays at instant speed. And even though you're getting a bit of a tempo loss by having to spend a whopping 5 mana, you get to kind of make up for that tempo loss with the Delirium ability by getting some card advantage and having until the end of your next turn to play it, so you're not in a rush to have to play it right out, since you won't have very much mana left off after casting this. So I actually think this card is pretty decent. I think the more problematic bombs that are, 5 and 6 toughness that are in the set, and the more consistently they show up in Limited, the more important this card will be in Limited. So it really depends on what Limited as a format looks like as a whole to determine how good and how high of a pick something like this ends up being. If there aren't too many creatures that this takes out that, another piece of removal can't take out, then it does go down in value considerably. That being said, if there are a bunch of problematic bombs that, a bunch of smaller damage spells aren't going to be able to deal with, and this could go way up in value. So we'll have to wait and see with the entire set, but the potential is definitely there. Next up, we've got Most Valuable Slayer. This is 1 red and 3 for a 2/4 human warrior. Whenever you attack, target attacking creature gets +1/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn. I actually kind of love this because not only can it swing in as a 3/4 first strike, which isn't that bad for 4, it's still not great, it's not like super on rate, but for a common, that's actually not too bad to pick up later in a draft. But where this card gets really good is the fact that you don't have to actually attack with this creature specifically in order to get the trigger. Attack with literally anything, and you can give that thing +1/+0 in first strike, or give any one thing that's attacking +1/+0 in first strike. So as long as you just have anything that can swing in that your opponent can't deal with, because it's going to have a high enough power when it gets that first strike, it just can't really be blocked without you just eating up their dude, then this is going to be really powerful. The more I think about this, the more I think this card is a slam dunk. I really think this is probably going to be a high pick in Limited. If you just have high power creatures and you're trying to play aggro, because it just makes it really impossible for your opponent to trade with pretty much anything, as long as you're running the right deck with the right creatures in it. So in that deck, this card's going to be nuts. If this creature itself had to attack, it wouldn't be nearly as good, but the fact that this can just sit back and block forever with a 4 toughness and send your biggest dude in there with first strike every turn and make it even bigger, yeah, that helps shut down stalemates really quick. So I think this will be a high draft pick if you're in the right deck where you can actually get the most value out of it. But next up, we've got Ragged Playmate. 1 red and 1 for a 2/2 artifact creature toy, and you can pay 1 and tap him. Target creature with power 2 or less can't be blocked this turn. this actually isn't that bad. It fills out your curve as a 2-drop common that you can pick up really late in the draft, and you can do a lot worse than to have this extra ability that can turn on later in the game, and just make one of your creatures get in for that little bit of extra damage you need to win the game, especially if the board is stalled and you're in a stalemate. You can use this to push through the stalemate. Honestly, not that bad on a creature that's, you know, kind of an on-rate 2/2 for 2 anyway. So, I don't think this thing's going to set the world on fire, but you could do a lot worse than to fill out your curve with one of these. Next up, we've got Valgavoth's Onslaught. This is our next rare. This is 1 green and double X for a sorcery. You manifest Dread X times, and then put X +1/+1 counters on each of those creatures. This card is actually kind of insane. I feel like this is a sleeper card, for sure, because the ceiling is super, super high, but the floor is not that bad. Even if you just play this for just 3 mana. Just 3 mana, right? It's going to give you a 3/3 creature. A 3/3 creature that can, you know, turn into something hopefully much more impactful than that later on in the game when you have a little bit more mana. And when it does, it gets to keep that +1/+1 counter. That's the thing you got to understand about any kind of like Manifest Dread or Disguise or Cloak combined with counters, is they don't leave play and come back when they get turned face up. So they get to keep all of their counters. So being able to Manifest Dread and then eventually turn it into a much more relevant threat that keeps the counter, so it's a bigger, better version of that relevant threat, while also basically scrying away a card from the top of your deck and getting something into the graveyard. There's like all these little bits of silver lining value. If you really look at the floor is not bad. I mean, it's not the most amazing thing ever, but it's actually very playable. And then it just starts to scale into oblivion and get ridiculous and out of hand. At 5 mana, you get 2 4/4s. Think about that. At 5 mana, you get 2 4/4s, and each of them can become, hopefully, hypothetically, much better creatures later on that keep 2 +1/+1 counters each. And that's just for 5. If you're playing this in a ramp deck and you get up to 7 or 9, this thing just starts to get insane. So having a little bit of on-curve board presence that can contend with your opponent's plays on turn 3, that can scale into the late game and be an absolutely ridiculous back-breaking game ender, just seems kind of nuts to me. And then if you combine this with anything like that copies stuff, like the Simic card that makes X copies of X things. I forget the name off the top of my head, so if you remember, let me know in the comments. But imagine using that card after using this card and making copies of all the face down creatures. In fact, I'm going to pose a question to you guys that are watching. Let me know in the comments. They changed the rules about tokens when they introduced incubate tokens, so that tokens retained, if you made a token copy of something, it tracks both sides of the card on the copy. And this was so that the rules would work elegantly with incubate tokens, since incubates transform. But one of the side benefits of that rules change is the fact that if you make a token copy of a transforming creature, the token can actually transform into its backside. It now keeps that information. It now knows what's supposed to be on the other side. So I'm almost positive that if you were to use that card, what is the name of that card? Somebody let me know in the comments. If you were to use that card to make a copy of all of your manifested face down creatures, it would keep track of all the bottom sides, and so all of those copies should now be able to transform and turn face up and become huge versions of those cards. If you just hit just like one crazy big threat like a Vein Ripper off of your Valgavoth's Onslaught, and then you make a bunch of copies of the face down Vein Ripper later on, you should be able to turn all of them face up into Vein Rippers that all keep the counters, and that just seems bananas. But I don't remember the name of that card right now, so let me know in the comments. But that seems bananas. Are there any other crazy synergies I'm overlooking that would also be nuts with this, or similar synergies to the ones that I pointed out? Let me know in the comments. I feel like there's so much potential here, and I feel like a lot of people are sleeping on it, because when you look at it and you read it the first time, the potential just kind of doesn't quite hit you, right? You really have to dig in deep and think about it, and you realize just how insane this could be. So let me know your thoughts on the card and what you do with it in the comments for sure. I think this thing is insane. But next up, we've got Cautious Survivor. This is 1 green and 3 for a 4/4 elf survivor with survival. At the beginning of your second main phase, if Cautious Survivor is tapped, you gain 2 life. So just a little bit of extra value for survivor decks. It's also just a 4/4 for 4, which historically has been pretty decent in limited. So you can snatch this up and fill out your curve and have a pretty reasonable piece of board presence for turn 4. And then if you're in that survival deck, being able to gain 2 life every turn is pretty nice. And in fact, since the body is so big, there's a much better chance you can just swing with this every turn and still get the life, and not have to worry as much about jumping through hoops to get the creature tapped as with some of the other survival creatures that are smaller and might die when they swing in. So pretty cool card, definitely fill out a lot of curves. Next up, we've got Coordinated Clobbering. This is 1 green mana for a sorcery, and you tap 1 or 2 target untapped creatures you control. They each deal damage equal to their power to target creature an opponent controls. So this is interesting. Only 1 mana and getting to deal essentially double damage to something that an opponent controls and have it be a bite effect and not a fight effect, so you don't risk losing your guys. All of that is awesome. Granted, you do have to tap down your creatures, and they have to be untapped when you tap them, so that does make this a little bit worse. That being said, 1 mana removal is 1 mana removal, so I think this is still awesome. I think this is still a very high pick in limited, and you absolutely jam it, but it stinks that the creatures have to already be untapped, and then you tap them down in order to deal the damage. It means you can't swing in first unless the creatures have vigilance. So I don't know, if there's some kind of a vigilance deck in limited, this gets even better. Maybe there's a vigilance deck in standard, and this could work, I don't know, maybe in that deck. Hard to say for sure, probably not, but it's an interesting new take on the bite spell, and I like that they're trying to explore this kind of design space. But next up, we've got Cryptid Inspector, 1 green and 2 for a 2/3 elf warrior with vigilance. Whenever a face-down permanent you control enters, and whenever Cryptid Inspector or another permanent you control is turned face-up, you put a +1/+1 counter on Cryptid Inspector. Interesting. So this is sort of meant to be a meat and potatoes common for the Manifest Dread deck, where it's just going to grow to insane girth every time you're playing, you know, a face-down permanent, every time you're manifesting Dread, and also at any time one of those turns face up as well. So I like this at common. I think this is much better than I expected the common, you know, card for that archetype to be, because it can just scale up into a very relevant threat that can end the game on its own. And it just happens for free, right? You don't have to spend any mana, you just have to do what your deck probably wants to do anyway, which is manifest Dread a bunch and turn those creatures face up. So I think this card is actually pretty cool. Next up, we've got Defiant Survivor, 1 green and 2 for a 3/2 human survivor with survival. It's a lot of surviving. At the beginning of your second main phase, if Defiant Survivor is tapped, manifest Dread. This is interesting. This sort of cross-pollinates the synergies of survival decks as an archetype in limited with Manifest Dread decks as an archetype in limited. So some kind of crazy Bant archetype you could possibly go into with this. But I like that this fits either into the survival deck or the Manifest Dread deck, and you can kind of get extra value out of either of those. But obviously, if there's a Bant deck that uses both, this is a slam dunk in there. I think just having a relevant 3-power creature for a 3 that can just spit out other creatures every turn under the right circumstances is kind of good enough on its own. So I actually think this is going to be really, really good in limited. It's going to be a very high pick if you're in green. Just draft the thing and play it. But next up, we've got Flesh Burrower. This is 1 green and 1 for a 2/2 insect with Death Touch. Love to see a 2/2 Death Touch for 2, honestly. And it's another insect. So more insect support. We saw, you know, some support for insect tribal a little earlier in spoiler season, so it's cool to see this. Whenever Flesh Burrower attacks, another target creature you control gains Death Touch until end of turn. So it's actually even better than a 2/2 Death Touch for 2. This might be the best common in green for limited. This is kind of gnarly. Normally the Death Touch creatures don't have an on-rate power, but this one's just a 2/2 that happens to have Death Touch, so it's relevant board presence on turn 2 that can trade for ridiculous bombs later in the game, and that can swing in and give another really good creature Death Touch until end of turn as well, which is just insane extra values. So yeah, this is going to be one of the commons in green that you draft pretty high, I think. It is still just curve filler at the end of the day, but it's a high pick for curve filler for sure. Next up, we've got Wickerfolk Thresher. This is 1 green and 3 for a 5/4 artifact creature Scarecrow. That alone, a 5/4 for 4, that's not a rare, that's an uncommon rarity, is going to be bananas in Limited, especially because it counts as an artifact, and there might be some other artifact synergies that this cares about. But we're not even done talking about the card because it also has Delirium. So whenever it attacks, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land, you may put it onto the battlefield. If you don't put the card onto the battlefield, put it into your hand. So this card is a slam dunk in Delirium decks. If you're filling up your graveyard quick and you're turning on Delirium quick in Limited, you are absolutely playing this card, and it is going to be a beast. It is going to come down on curve, be a super relevant threat that's just going to start to ramp you into oblivion. And the best part about this card that might be easily overlooked is the fact that that land comes onto the battlefield untapped. Nowhere on this card does it say it enters the battlefield tapped. So you get to use it right away, right? If it's turn 5 and you attack and you get another land onto the play, you could potentially play a 6-drop without even getting any other, without ever casting any other kind of ramp spell the entire game leading up to that. This is the only thing that ramps you. You can still cast a 6-drop on 5 while having a relevant threat on the board that you want to keep swinging with. That just seems really amazing to me, so this is a high pick green card for sure. But next up, we've got Intruding Soul Rager. This is a 2/2 spirit with vigilance for 2 mana in the colors of Izzet, and you can tap it and sack a room. Intruding Soul Rager deals 2 damage to each opponent, and you draw a card. This is kind of gnarly. Honestly, a 2/2 vigilance for 2 is kind of okay to begin with, especially, you know, at a rarity that's less than rare. Being able to sack rooms for 2 damage and drawing a card is nuts. Like, this would be pretty good even without drawing a card. Getting to draw a card is bananas, and there are some rooms where the value you're getting out of them are triggers that happen when you first unlock the rooms. So if you get your value, if you get your creature tokens or whatever you get from unlocking those rooms, being able to sack it later when it's not as useful to just deal 2 damage and draw another card to replace it seems kind of bananas. Or if you just get in the late game and maybe the rooms that you have out are valuable still on the battlefield, but they're down to like 4 life, so you can just sack one at the end of their turn to do 2 to them, draw a card, and then sack another one on your turn and kill them. Like, that seems really awesome. This is definitely a signpost card, right? If you get this, I think you first pick it and you go deep into rooms. Or if you happen to get a really good rare or mythic rare room early and you know you're going to be in the room archetype in Limited, and this comes up at some point, you just slam it. This is going to be a very, very high pick if you know you're in that archetype. Just the value it gets you, drawing a card is nuts. But being a win condition as well that doesn't even have to get through is also nuts. And being an attacker and a blocker because of vigilance, the whole package is just super good. So I think if you're in that archetype, it is a slam dunk. Even if you're not, if you happen to be in Izzet, maybe you have like 1 or 2 rooms in your deck, you could do a lot worse than to play this 2/2 vigilance for 2 that might have extra value later on the game if you happen to hit a room. So I just love this card. I think it's amazing. But next up, we've got our next rare. This is Charred Foyer and Warped Space, another enchantment room. Speaking of rooms, Charred Foyer is 1 red and 3, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you exile the top card of your library. You may play it this turn. So a nice little bit of recurring card advantage every single turn. That being said, it is kind of expensive to do that. 4 mana, sort of do nothing. You have to play the card the same turn you exile it, right? Not until the end of your next turn. So that makes it incredibly tricky to use, especially for a 4-drop. Yeah, that's really slow. So what does Warped Space do? 2 red and 4 for an enchantment room. Once each turn, you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for a spell you cast from exile. That ability is really powerful, but again, 6 mana is a lot. So I think both sides of this room are pretty expensive for what they do and very slow. If this sees play at all, and I have to assume it will if they made it a mythic, I gotta assume it's in some kind of crazy combo deck. And we did see some is-it colored rooms earlier in spoiler season that support sort of a room deck archetype, even in constructed. So it is possible this could line up with that really well. We saw a room that gives you 2 red mana every single turn, but you can only use that mana on rooms. That really helps play and unlock the sides of this card, so maybe something like that works. That being said, even in Standard right now, we have a ton of support for Exile decks playing from Exile decks, whether it be Adventures. We've got Pia Noir, we've got the Elephant Planeswalker dude, we've got Rocco Street Chef, we've got all this crazy support for playing from Exile. So it is very possible that that deck makes a comeback and that this is a part of it, but I don't know, man. On first inspection, this just seems really expensive. I feel like by the time you're able to do the things you want to do, you've wasted so much tempo. So my gut says this isn't quite there, but it's a mythic, right? So maybe there's just something we're missing. Maybe there's some crazy way to abuse this or get it out cheaper, unlock it cheaper, or whatever that we're just not taking into account. So if you have ideas about this card, definitely let me know in the comments, because I absolutely think there's something I'm missing here, and there's something that Wizards of the Coast intends this card to be used in that is busto, because otherwise it wouldn't be a mythic, right? The ability is super powerful. I'm just worried about how long it takes to get all of that online. But next up, we've got Midnight Mayhem. This is a 4-mana sorcery in the color of Boros, and you create 3 1/1 red gremlin creature tokens, and gremlins you control gain menace, lifelink, and haste until end of turn. Are we seeing gremlin tribal? Can that be a thing? The fact that this gives all gremlins menace, lifelink, and haste until end of turn is kinda gnarly if we can go super wide with a board full of gremlins, right? I think that's part of this card that could be easily overlooked, because we're not used to having very many gremlins, like, you know, in the standard card pool right now. Being said, this is mainly meant for limited, right? And even if you don't have any other gremlins in the deck, 3 1/1s for 4 mana that are 1/1 menace lifelinking hasters the first turn they come into play probably get through unblocked, gain you a little bit of life, and then sit around as, you know, fodder to block things or sacrifice fodder or what else. Yeah, the more I think about it, I think this is meant to be used with sacrifice decks, some kind of new aristocrat deck for sure. But I'm really hoping that there's a gremlins tribal thing we can make work. We've seen a lot of the sets so far, and we haven't seen very many gremlins, so I don't think that's the case, but I'm holding out hope, because it would be super cool if this card ends up being way better than it looks, because there are just a bunch of really good gremlin creatures. I don't know. We're gonna have to wait and see. Next up, we've got Found Footage. This is 1 mana for an artifact clue. You may look at face-down creatures your opponents control at any time, just straight up when it's on the battlefield. No hoops to jump through. Also, you can pay 2 and sacrifice it to surveil 2 and draw a card. I kind of like this. It is a common. It replaces itself really easy. I think it's a little bit better in the Delirium decks or the Self-Mill decks, because the Surveil 2 will matter so much more in those decks. But getting to replace itself if you don't need the ability is kind of okay. I don't think it's that great. That being said, the one thing I do wonder about this card is, since it technically counts as a clue, we did get a lot of clue support in Murders at Karlov Manor, and I'm wondering if maybe there's a clue standard deck that this actually is worth playing in. Maybe this can show up in the clue deck. Maybe that deck just needs 1 or 2 more cards to really send it home and make it viable. In standard, probably not. But who knows? We did see, I don't remember what cards off the top of my head, but there are cards in that set that get value when you sacrifice clues and that sort of thing. So it's possible this could see play. I doubt it, but it does seem pretty interesting. Next up, we've got Friendly Teddy. This is 2 mana for a 2/2 artifact creature bear toy, and when it dies, each player draws a card. Yeah, that seems pretty fine. I mean, both players get to draw a card, which kind of sucks, but it works really well with Pinhead, who deals a damage to the opponent when they draw. So that's kind of cool. If you happen to first pick a Pinhead, you could do worse than to play this as your 2-drop, getting to draw a card yourself to replace it when it dies. It's probably the epitome of a curve filler, though. It can work in any color deck. It fills your most important curve slot at 2 mana if you're running short on 2-drop creatures. So yeah, pick this up later in the draft if you need to fill that slot. Next up, we've got Optimistic Scavenger. This is 1 white mana for a 1/1 human scout with Eerie. Whenever an enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. The target creature is what makes this so good, and that makes me wonder if this might just be good enough for Constructed. I think this replaces the 𝐺𝐿𝐄𝐖 guy that rotated out in Kamigawa in Standard, because this triggers off every time you play an enchantment. You just get to throw a +1/+1 counter anywhere you want, which is pretty much the same as that guy, but there's some extra value in this one in that it also triggers on unlocking rooms. So I think this will actually be Standard relevant. If there is a Standard Eerie deck, which there almost certainly will be, getting to just shoot counters off every time an enchantment enters is going to be super good in that deck. And if any of those enchantments are rooms, getting an extra trigger off that card by unlocking the other room on the room card seems like it just gives you even more value than you would normally get out of a card like this. So I think this card might see play in Standard. I really think it has a chance. It's absolutely going to be amazing in Limited. I think this is probably a first pickable if you know you're deep into Enchantment Tribal or just the room deck in general or some combination of that. This is just an insane amount of value if you can get it out on 1 and follow it up with like every enchantment creature ever. So I think this card is awesome. Probably want to first pick it unless you get a Balmy Rare. It's just nuts. But next up we have Gremlin Tamer. Yay, more gremlins. A 2/2 human scout with Eerie for 2 mana in the colors of Azorius. And the Eerie ability is whenever an enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room, you create a 1/1 red gremlin creature token. Interesting that it creates red gremlins when it's an Azorius card. Obviously there's some kind of a Boros archetype that's trying to center around gremlins, and I am completely here for it. Gizmo, Mogwai, let's go. Mogwai's a good band. I digress. This card's awesome. I love the flavor. I like that they're leaning into, you know, the old 80s horror movie tropes of like actually having a gremlin show up in this. That is an obvious wink and a nod, and I sort of love it. We absolutely have to build the gremlin deck, right? Even if it sucks, we have to try it. We have to try and brew gremlins just as deep as we can. Clearly it's going to be an enchantment themed deck because of the Eerie trigger here, and it's probably going to be Boros because we saw the Azorius card earlier, so, or sorry, it's going to be, clearly it's going to be Jeskai because we saw the Boros card earlier, and this is Azorius. So we have to try to brew that for sure. Will it be good enough in Limited? I hope so, man. I hope so, because I want to draft it. But next up we have Rootwise Survivor. A 3/4 human survivor with haste for 2 green and 3, and it has this survival ability. So many survivors written on one card. Tends to be the case with these survivor cards. At the beginning of your second main phase, if Rootwise Survivor is tapped, put 3 +1/+1 counters on up to 1 target land you control. That land becomes a 0/0 elemental creature in addition to its other types and gains haste until your next turn. Wow. That's really good. I think this guy is really good in Limited. Is it possible this sees playing Constructed? Probably not. Probably not. It's too slow, right? But a 3/4 that can swing in immediately as a surprise that your opponent's not prepared to block or prepared to have, you know, instant removal held up for, that can then get in and give you another 3/3 seems kind of awesome. Even if you can just trigger this once, which the haste really helps you to do, you have a 3/4 and a 3/3 that they need to contend with for 5 mana. And if it does stay alive, it just swings in every turn and does that. This card is really good. As far as value, Obviously, if they have a way to get it off the board before you can swing in effectively with it, or if they have a big enough blocker, it's going to go down in value. But again, because you have the haste here, you kind of have the element of surprise, so you should be able to make sure you at least get in once with it and get that 3/3. And I think that's valuable even by itself, so I actually really like this card. I don't think it's like first pickable or anything, but it's not a late pick either. I think if you're in the survival deck, you actually, yeah, you try to grab this somewhat early. Not like early, but definitely not late. Next up, we've got Withering Torment. 1 black and 2 for an instant. Destroy target creature or enchantment. You lose 2 life. Shoot me. Shoot me now. Stop giving black enchantment removal. I don't care if it's overcost at that 3 mana. I don't care if you lose 2 life. Stop doing it. Stop doing it. Just stop doing it. I'm so sick of black being able to destroy enchantments. Why can black do everything? Maybe I just have PTSD from Invoke Despair. That might be what it is. This card's great. You're going to first pick this. You're going to slam dunk it. It's the only thing in black that can destroy enchantments, and enchantments are huge in this set, so you're going to first pick it every time you see it. The fact that it's never useless because it can destroy a creature as well. The fact that it's instant speed, so you can blow your opponent out as a combat trick. All of that makes it great. It doesn't even matter that you lose 2 life. I mean, it will matter. Don't get me wrong. But enchantment removal, 3 mana instant speed enchantment removal, and an enchantment themed set that can be creature removal if you don't have an enchantment to hit, yes. You first pick this and you play it if you're in black. If you're in black, you never pass one of these. That's it. That's it. That's all I have to say about that. I hate it. Next up, we have Abant Oculus. I think this might be the last card of the day. This is 1 blue and 2 for a 5/5 creature eye. It's a mythic. It has flying. It's a 3 mana 5/5 flyer. Oh god. As an additional cost to cast this spell, exile 6 cards from your graveyard. So, does have a hoop to jump through, even though it's only 3 mana. That being said, there are some decks that can very easily fill up your own graveyard pretty quickly. So keep that in mind. That downside, depending on how you brew your deck, might not be very much of a downside. It has another ability here. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, Manifest Dread. Man, we've seen a ton of Manifest Dread support today. I'm really starting to think that deck's going to be a thing in Standard, and I am so completely here for it. Being able to make a 2/2 every single turn, on top of getting a 5/5 flyer for 3, that's just bananas. That is so power. And again, you do have to exile 6 cards before you can play this. So, half the decks that want to play this, they won't be able to play this on curve on 3, and you need to keep that in mind. But that being said, if you're in the right deck, and this can come down on 3, this is just insane. This is just insane. Oh, you know what this is really crazy with? Any of the cards that can return something that costs 3 or less from your graveyard to play. Because technically this costs 3 or less, and you only have to exile the 6 cards as an additional cost to cast it, not when it enters the battlefield. So literally any of the white cards that return a 3-drop from your battlefield to play can get this out super early. All you have to do is self-mill it early, which is easy to do in a deck where you want to be self-milling stuff early anyways, because you want this in the graveyard to get back, and you want things in the graveyard anyway, because you're going to be manifesting dread and putting things in the graveyard, so you want to be able to support that mechanic. That just seems perfect. Yeah, we absolutely do this. Maybe we even play it in Esper with Zoraline, because Zoraline's triggered ability can bring it back. Oh, the more I think about this, the more I think this card is disgusting. It can go in decks with Zoraline. It can go in all of those decks that have the really cheap bring something back that's 3 mana or less. It can go in all of the Manifest Dread decks. It just feels like there's so many ways to build around this card that are awesome. This is absolutely going to make a splash in Standard. I don't know which deck is going to be the deck to get the most out of this card and actually be a contender in Standard, but mark my words, one of the decks that uses this guy will be a relevant threat on the Standard ladder. I promise. because this is just insane. But if you have ideas about how you would use this, definitely let me know in the comments. I feel like this thing is insanely versatile. There's so many little ways to get around the hoops you have to jump through to play it. And it just seems insane. If your opponent doesn't deal with it, a 5/5 flyer is not only a crazy clock if you can get it out early, but you're getting a 2/2 every turn and filling up your graveyard every turn. And the 2/2 can probably become a better creature if you happen to hit a better creature off the manifest later on. So you got to remember that about manifesting Dread, guys. Like, because you get a creature that can be a much bigger creature later on if you hit the right cards, it's almost like drawing a card too. It's almost like you drew whatever creature it can eventually turn into. Because turning it face up and turning it into that creature is almost as good as just playing that creature from your hand, right? The only real downside is you lose the 2/2 vanilla. But that's so small in comparison to all the upside you get here. You get a 2/2 now, could be a huge threat later. You get, you know, stuff into the yard that you can probably use. This card is so busted. Manifest Dread decks are going to be busted. This is awesome. I can't wait to brew around this. Honestly, early access can't come soon enough. But that's going to do it for today. Make sure you like the video if you haven't already, because liking the video helps me get the video out to so many more people, and I really need the help. It's a lot of work putting these together. As you could probably tell while I was filming this, I'm exhausted, but I need to make sure I get this deck, this video done and out to you guys as soon as possible so that you get a chance to see all these new cards while they're still fresh and new. So smash that like button, help me out, subscribe if you're new so you never miss an upload, and make sure you show up for early access for Duskmorn, a 24-hour marathon stream, September 18th. Join me. We're going to be doing all the crazy decks, man. I have so many decks I'm working on behind the scenes. I am going to be putting up a YouTube video. That's the 10 that I'm most looking forward to, so that you guys can get a sneak peek into what's going on in my crazy brain. And if you want a deeper look at, you know, behind the scenes at what I've got coming, make sure to join me on Twitch, where I stream live Monday through Friday. That's twitch.tv/quarantined_Capricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. I'll see you tomorrow for more spoilers. I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Wonders of the First. Wonders of the First is a brand new collectible card game similar to games like Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon, featuring a unique action-based resource economy that helps avoid pitfalls like Mana Flood or Mana Screw, and a battlefield containing multiple realms that unlock over time as you fight for control of the stones. The first 400 card set is called Existence and will launch to retail in the fall, but playtest team starter kits are available to order now. And they haven't forgotten about all you collectors out there. The game contains alternate borderless art variants, as well as highly sought after limited edition numbered prints, culminating in a one-of-one stone foil. And the best part is that the developers have a community-first approach, with 8 print-and-play decks available on their website, as well as a version of the game available on Tabletop Simulator, all for free. For more information, be sure to check out wondersccg.com today. That's wondersccg.com. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.